I want to thank Peter and Henya for inviting me to do this. I'm extremely honored, and I hope that you get something out of today. I grew up in Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada, and I've taught at Arizona State for the last 25 years. I'm very interested in the relationship between performance, performing arts and social justice and human rights, and that took me to study ethics, and I then was very interested in how people in these areas could become better informed of ethical theories to help inform their practice. So today I'm looking at three different issues. One is to look at the inherent tensions, both because of the focuses of art, activism, and ethics between those different areas, as well as historical tensions that exist. I'm also hoping to provide some insight into the main kind of ethical theories behind a lot of socially engaged art or community theater and dance, and also provide some suggestions for how to do moral reasoning when there's issues and problems. And I'm going to read as well as talk to you as we go. So first, understanding the tensions between ethics, art, and activism. Beginning with ethics, it's a branch of philosophy concerned with questions of how people ought to act, not how they act now, but how should they act. It's in the subjunctive. It's how should we live. And it's geared towards finding ways of understanding how to define good and bad, right and wrong. Normative ethics is a part of ethics concerned with establishing criteria of what is morally right and wrong. And there's three major different kinds of approaches. In other words, all ways of reasoning. This is Western ethics, I should say. So all Western ethics can kind of be broken down into three major types of theories. There are deontological theories that emphasize universal rules or laws. These are very laws, rules-oriented, and also universal. So human rights, for instance, the idea of human rights where it would fall under this category, if you believe in human rights. Consequentialist theories focus on consequences or results, and virtue theories prioritize your character or the personality of a person. So I'm going to give a quick, an example of a good human being would be someone who is like Mother Teresa. I think you would all agree that she is high up on the good moral human being person. And often we think of them as selfless, generous, humble, compassionate, caring, honest, respectful, and accepting. Do you think these are always the kinds of words that you would give to a so-called genius or great artist? No, not always, right? So you can already start to see that there's some issues. The important thing I just want to explain, which I gave to some of the students in class yesterday, was that ethics is very complicated, and there's many different ways to think about what is right and wrong, and it's very informed by your worldview and your ideas of human beings. But to just quickly give an example, I don't know how many of you were speeding on the way to the lecture today, but imagine you were speeding and someone pulled you over, a policeman. Peter, you might want to briefly help with this example. But if you're caught speeding and the policeman says, you broke the law and I'm writing you a ticket, and you say, yes, I broke the law and I deserve a ticket, then you're all following a deontological way of thinking.
אם תפסו אתכם על מהירות ואתם אומרים לשוטר, נכון, אני עברתי את המהירות המותרת, אז אני נכנס למסגרת הדאונטולוגית, החוקים והכללים שנקבעו על ידי המערכת.
Right, now if he says you broke the law and you say, well, I was speeding because I'm trying to get to the hospital in order to be there before my grandmother dies, and he says, okay, I will hop in my car and I will accompany you and take you there because I agree that you need to get there, then that's consequentialist because you both believe the consequences make it a good act.
אני ממהר להגיע לבית החולים לפני שסבתא שלי תמות, ואז הוא אומר, בסדר, אני אלווה אותך, ואז בעצם זה מוכתב על ידי התוצאה, להגיע לסבתא בזמן, וזאת אתיקה תוצאתית.
And then the last example would be if you say, well, really, I'm such a good person, and I never break the law, and please forgive me, and the cop says, no, I'm giving you a ticket anyway, then you have two conflicting views, virtue theory, which is character-based, versus deontological, which is rule-based.
אז אם אני הנהג ואני טוען שאני אדם טוב ואני אף פעם לא נוסע במהירות וזו פעם הראשונה, אבל השוטר אומר זה לא מעניין אותי, בכל זאת תקבל קנס, אז יש פה התנגשות בין האתיקה הדאונטולוגית של הכללים והחוקים לבין האתיקה של ה-virtues, של המידות טובות של האדם, ופה יש לנו קונפליקט.
Thank you, that's it. Okay, so you can imagine just with those three things, how you can immediately have three people with different views who immediately get into a big argument because they're all following different ways of thinking about what is right and wrong and good and bad. And there's many, many, many ways that can play out. So let's turn to art. So in other words, ethics deals with good and bad, right and wrong. In art, in the Western philosophical tradition, it's often associated with the branch of philosophy that deals with principles of beauty and artistic taste. And it's about sense perception, formal properties like line, shape, color, texture, etc. And in the tradition in art is to see, I mean, for those who follow art for art's sake, there's a long tradition to see art as autonomous, as free of any moral or political purpose. So the arts for art's sake movement is an example of that. And in fact, many artists today and at that time believed that the value, the intrinsic value of art lies in itself, and art should actually never be judged in moral or didactic terms, and that to do so is to corrupt art. It's to look beyond the painting to what it means, which actually takes away from the art. So this is a tradition in which art is really seen as against morality, and for these artists, they want complete artistic freedom, autonomy. They do not want morality to be containing them, like a straitjacket, and making it impossible to do anything creative and interesting. Is that clear? Do you think? Yes, okay. What is often in the West, our idea of a great artist? Someone, I think you spoke about Oscar Wilde, right? Didn't you mention Oscar Wilde? Right. So, highly creative, right? Egocentric, maybe arrogant, highly opinionated, often against rules or unconcerned with rules because they want freedom, and maybe even decadent. That the idea of genius is historically linked with madness, mental illness, and substance abuse, and that is often, at least in the West and in dance for sure, it can kind of related to cruelty and abuse of others, especially dancers and actors. So I show here Jerome Robbins, Bob Fosse, and Martha Graham, who were all known for really being cruel, and yet it was defended and rationalized because they were geniuses, and so it was okay. And it continues to be like that, I would say. Many people, maybe you in this room, have examples where genius is seen as an excuse for strange behavior or abusive behavior. Okay, so is that clear? Everybody with me? Okay. So activism. Often the focus is to work collectively to promote, impede, direct, or intervene in social, political, economic, or environmental reform, with the clear aim to make changes in society, right? So you're probably already thinking, where does that rub up against art and morality? So activists often can put aside their personal agendas for a collective vision. Do you think that's easy for an artist? No, it's not, right? Because often they're interested in their own vision. Often interested in developing broad platforms to be adhered to. Again, that could be considered a straitjacket for an artist. Insistently and intentionally, peacefully, but also sometimes violently, promoting specific causes. And again, artists aren't necessarily interested in being so specific on their message. A lot of artists like to have ambiguous or ambivalent kinds of work that have many layers of interpretation. So once again, that can cause some issues. Some social, if you think of a so-called great social political activist, Martin Luther King is someone that comes to mind for me. Single-minded about a particular cause and working with others to achieve that, hopefully, for the better. What's important to notice is that often, or not, sometimes, often, many activists are driven by a particular perspective, or an ism is what I call it, or an ideology. And again, that can go against an artist's desire to focus on, let's say, ideas around beauty or aesthetics, also around excellence. Sometimes activists don't care or aren't interested in whether a performance is good quality. They're more interested in the message. And also artists might be, again, interested in individual freedom. And then it rubs up activism can very easily rub up against ethics, because ethicists can look at a problem from many different angles and think about how it's being framed, whereas an activist might see something in very black and white terms, like it's right or it's wrong. Like if you're a feminist, then maybe you'll blame right away the men in the situation without looking at all the different perspectives, or if you're a Marxist, you might blame the manager, etc. So again, it can be difficult in terms of connecting with ethics. So to summarize this part, I just want to say that there's these inherent as well as historical reasons that tensions exist between these realms. And the reason I point this out is sometimes people working in this realm of community theater or dance assume that there's this natural connection between being an artist and an activist, and that everybody is working towards the greater good. And I just want to point out that there's a lot of tensions that exist. So the next thing I want to talk about are the kinds of ethical beliefs that I see behind a lot of community theater, community dance, or socially engaged theater art. And these are, the point I want to make here is that people in this field are drawing on a lot of different ethical perspectives. And some of these relate easily to each other, and sometimes they are in direct conflict, and I don't think people realize that, so they don't work through some of those problems proactively. So I'm going to go through some of what these are, and I don't know how many of you believe these things. So how many of you believe that there are human rights that are universal? Universal human rights. Okay. All right, so if you look at your handout, it has, I think, a little bit more detail here, but universal human rights are the belief that people have inherent rights regardless of context. And there is a duty, this is from a deontological perspective, so they're universal, they're these sort of rights and rules, so that there exists a duty to fulfill those rights. Obligations and duties go together. So some of these might be treating people as moral agents, that you treat everybody with respect regardless of who they are, and everybody you may decide should have the ability to have informed consent. So let's say that you're in a community group and you decide, I believe everybody should have informed consent, and they sign off on their project and they understand what they're involved in. That would be like an example of that. All right, so how many of you care about social justice? Social justice. Okay, so here there's again, it's a kind of from a deontological background. There's a focus on issues of fairness, and that in any context there's a fair distribution of goods. Okay, that could be actual goods or kind of symbolic goods. According to, and social justice is often governed by impartial reason. So you look at a group of people and you're like, okay, we have all these goods and we're going to distribute them fairly, regardless of sort of whether they're family or whether they're not family or their mother, father, that doesn't matter, we're going to do it all fairly. Okay, how many of you believe that you need to maintain respect for others' beliefs and practices, that you have to care about other people, like their perspective? Okay. Right. Okay, do you see a problem yet? Okay, so there's a problem because if you believe in C and you believe in A, there can be immediately a problem. Let's say that you believe that there's a human right that anybody can dance with anybody, right? And they can touch and they can dance in any form, and men and women can dance together and they can touch. And then you go into a community and no, they don't believe the same thing, right? So what do? So that's an example of how two different of these values can come up against each other. Okay, how many of you think you're trying to make a positive difference and minimize harm? All right. Okay, again, that can be pretty tricky, right? Because what happens if the community that you're working with has a different idea of health versus what you have? In the US, we just had a big issue with people who were in the religious Jewish community who weren't immunizing their kids. So they had a different idea of what good health was, and then, you know, all of these people were getting measles, and that was causing a big problem. So
we've had the same.
Oh, you had the problem. Okay.
עם החיסון נגד חצבת והסרבנות לחסן נגד.
Right. So there's different ideas. Even you could all think, oh well, we all agree on what is good health, but then it turns out that no, people have different ideas of what good health is and bad health, and so how do you negotiate those? So the next one is belief that people are formed by their environment, so that we need to intervene and change the environment to change the situation. So a lot of community, engagement.
On the next slide.
Okay, thank you. That's belief that people are formed by their environment. Okay, so how do you deal with that? You need to change the environment. So the problem here is that if you believe this, then at the same time you can't necessarily hold individuals responsible for their behavior. So that is tricky because some of the ethical theories, like the human rights and some of the other ones, believe that each individual is responsible for their own behavior. But if you think the environment shapes behavior completely, let's say, then you're already in a difficulty. Are we okay? Okay, so the next is, if you believe in feminist ethics, you might really care about compassion and sensitivity to context. That may rub up against the idea of things being universal or things being regardless of context. Feminist ethics argues that you need to look at the specific situation. And if there's family members, for instance, or friends, those are more important. You need to look at the micro level and take care of the people closest to you first. And then the last two are interesting because one of them is about personal and professional integrity. I'm sure many of you care about your personal integrity. And then how does that relate to working collaboratively? What happens if you're in a situation where you've been working on a piece collaboratively, you come to the end of the process and you're supposed to put on a performance, and someone in the group or something happens in the group, do you go with what the group wants, or do you go with what you believe is personally the right thing to do? Do any of these resonate with you? Have you been in conflicts? Okay, good. All right, so that's all to say that things can be complicated even though you might have a set of beliefs that you hold true to. Let's look at, so what do you do when you have a problem? I'm sure some of you have thoughts about that. My suggestion is, well, these are some examples, it doesn't matter, we can go on. My advice is to get trained in ethics and ethical research. At my university, we have these processes where scientists have to get training in ethics if they're using human subjects. That means people, right? I believe all artists should get the same training. And it's more complicated for artists because of a lot of reasons that we can talk about, but I really believe that it's important to get a sense of what ethics is all about and why it's so important to look at human subject research and think of performance as a kind of research with human subjects, like theater and dance, working with people as human subjects. Often there's professional organizations, especially now with the Me Too movement, which is, really asked some important questions, that there are more and more ethics guidelines being developed by theater organizations and dance organizations. It's important to understand your own values and preferences. Are you someone who likes rules? Or are you someone who believes in human beings as characters? The other thing is to consider issues when first designing a project. That's critical. The more that you can think through possible problems early on in the process, the easier it will be to implement, and not run into problems down the road. I think one of the most important is things like informed consent. That means that your performers or your participants understand what they're getting into at the beginning and whether they can leave the project for certain reasons. Let's say there's nudity, that they know that up front that there's going to be nudity in the piece and that they have an ability to not be part of it. Is that clear? Sure.
שאחד הדברים החשובים זה שהיוצרים, אומנים שאתם עובדים איתם, חברי קהילה, השחקנים, ידעו מראש ויתנו את הסכמתם מראש לפרויקט שנעשה, ואז דוגמה שנעמי נתנה זה שנניח שזו תופעה שכוללת עירום, אז שחקנית צריכים לדעת את זה מראש כדי לתת את הסכמתם או אי הסכמתם, ואי אפשר להגיד להם את זה במהלך החזרות, עכשיו צריך להתפשט.
The other is to really understand when an ethical dilemma comes up, what is the ethical dilemma? Like really try to analyze what the problem is to understand what needs to be done. Because sometimes things are clearly right versus wrong. Like if someone's broken a law, then you can understand that that's a situation where someone has actually done something wrong. But often it's right, what we call right versus right, which is, this is the third one down. Is it right versus right? In other words, maybe it's a situation where someone values honesty over loyalty, and they're coming to you and complaining about something, and they're being very honest, and then someone else gets really upset because they believe that they should be loyal rather than honest. So those conflicting values, but it's not clearly right or wrong. And try to be creative and to find compromise. And one of the most important things I think is that when you've made a decision, to explain your reasons so that people understand. Because sometimes they don't agree, but they can respect you for that. Did you want to say anything? No, okay, that's clear. Okay, so this is my question: how to make good art and how to make art good. Right? So I think I just want to conclude by saying I grew up in a home that was really committed to a democratic view of the arts, in which belief in artistic excellence went hand in hand with engaging everyday people in creativity as a means of making society a more equitable and joyful environment. So I really believe in socially engaged art practice. What I'm not in favor of is the avoidance of serious study of ethics and looking at ethics as part of arts practice. And that's because performing arts, especially theater and dance, has had a very long history of abusive practices towards dancers and actors. And there's been a myth of artistic genius and pedagogical approaches that date back to the 18th century that haven't changed a lot in some places. And I think that the only way to train these new generation is to give them other models. And there's another side, which is that I often see in progressive contemporary arts context, people speaking about equity and inclusion, but their practice continues to be patriarchal and authoritarian, so that even though they're speaking in a certain way, the actual way that they're running their companies or that they're acting is actually contrary to their so-called beliefs. So that's why I'm interested in research that examines the workings of these contemporary collaborative community work. So I want to just say thank you, and I hope that was informative.